Anti-Semitism is a plague to humanity, and it is responsible for many of the worst horrors in human history. We all have a duty to confront anti-Semitism in all its forms and everywhere and anywhere it appears. The American people reject hatred, bigotry, prejudice, and violence. We are a nation that believes in religious liberty, tolerance, and respect. And we are a people who cherish the dignity of every human life. Today, America grieves for the precious lives that were cruelly stolen. Our hearts ache for every person who lost a loved one. The 11 Jewish Americans who were horribly murdered represented the very best of our nation. They were brothers and sisters who looked out for each other. They were doctors who cared for citizens in need. They were proud grandparents who taught their grandchildren to value faith, family, and country. And they were the religious heart of the Tree of Life community. Our nation mourns the loss of these extraordinary Americans, and we also pray for those who were wounded. Our hearts are with the 4 brave police officers who were shot and injured while trying to stop the attack. We thank God for these officers and for every member of law enforcement who responded swiftly and bravely. In the wake of the attack, we have witnessed Americans of every faith and tradition coming together to mourn with their fellow citizens, to support one another, and to stand in solidarity with America's Jewish community. The President cherishes the American Jewish community for everything it stands for and contributes to our country. He adores Jewish Americans as part of his own family. The President is the grandfather of several Jewish grandchildren. His daughter is a Jewish American, and his son-in-law is a descendant of Holocaust survivors. Tomorrow, the President and First Lady will travel to Pennsylvania to express the support of the American people and grieve with the Pittsburgh community. And with that, I will take your questions. Jonathan.
Sir, the President said over the weekend that he could tone up his rhetoric. What does he mean by that? And does he have any concern at all that his words could inspire or provoke troubled people to do awful things?
Certainly, the President wants, in moments where our country is hurting like we've seen in the last several days, find ways to bring our country together, and we've seen him do exactly that. However, the President is going to continue to draw contrasts, particularly as we go into the final days of an election, the differences between the two parties, particularly on policy differences. You'll continue to see him make that contrast, but he has certainly, I think, found those moments to bring our country together and certainly focus on some of the things that all of us can support and all of us can condemn as well.
But he's also harshly attacked some of the very people that received those pipe bombs, and this morning suggesting that the news media is responsible for the anger in the country. How does he do that when, in the case of the pipe bomber, this was somebody who went to Trump rallies, this is somebody who had a van covered with attacks on the media and praise for the president. The shooter in Pittsburgh is somebody who was provoked, it seems, by the caravan that the president has spent so much time talking about. Why is he out there? When you say he's trying to unite the country, why is he out there making these attacks?
The very first thing that the President did was condemn the attacks both in Pittsburgh and in the pipe bombs. The very first thing the media did was blame the President and make him responsible for these ridiculous acts. That is outrageous that would be the very first reaction of so many people across this country. I'm not finished. The only person responsible for carrying out either of these heinous acts were the individuals who carried them out. It's not the President, no more than it was Bernie Sanders' fault for the individual who shot up a baseball field of congressional Republicans. You can't start putting the responsibility of individuals on anybody but the individual who carries out the crime.
Why is the President suggesting it's the news media? The President's the one placing blame here.
No, the President's not placing blame. The President's not responsible for these acts. Again, the very first action that the President did was condemn these heinous acts. The very first thing that the media did was condemn the President and go after and try to place blame, not just on the President, but everybody that works in this administration. The major news network's first public statement was to blame the President, and myself included. I mean, that is outrageous that anybody other than the individual who carried out the crime would hold that responsibility. Steve?
What's he going to take to stop these killings from happening over and over and over again?
You know, I think if we had a good answer to that, I think everybody in the country would support it. If anybody knows the answer, I think certainly this administration would be all ears. The President spends every single minute of every single day looking for the best ways to protect the safety and security of Americans, and we're going to continue to do that. John?
There's a second thing. Is the president going to give a speech on immigration this week? What's your thinking about options in terms of closing the border?
We'll keep you posted if there's any scheduling announcement on an address on that topic. I'm not aware of that at this point in time.
11 Jewish leaders in the Pittsburgh area have said that the president's visit denounces fully and forthrightly white nationalism. Does the White House believe this president has done enough to denounce white nationalism?
The president has denounced racism, hatred, and bigotry in all forms on a number of occasions. We'll continue to do that. I'm doing it here today. And I would also say at the same time that some individuals, they're grieving, they're hurting. The president wants to be there to show the support of this administration for the Jewish community. The rabbi said that he is welcome as well. And certainly we want to show our support for those individuals.
I know that there was another meeting this morning about what to do about the border. You're thinking about an executive action, maybe some sort of regulatory action. Is one of the options being discussed making it impossible for anybody to claim asylum unless they enter through a port of entry? So that would mean that anybody who crosses the border illegally would not be able to make a valid claim of asylum?
There are a lot of options that are being discussed right now. The number one priority is looking for ways to secure our borders. We'd love for Democrats in Congress to actually help step up and do their job and help us do that. If they don't and they're unwilling to do, as they've shown in the past that they are, then we're looking at administrative actions that will help and allow us to do so. Raquel?
Sarah, thank you very much. About the Brazilian election, the State Department repeated today that the commitment to promoting human rights and democracy will continue to guide the relationship with Brazil. However, the Brazilian president-elected, Bolsonaro, has made very controversial comments about minorities. The opposition defended the military dictatorship in Brazil. My question is if the White House plans to address this and ask assurances from the government, the incoming government in Brazil, that they will protect human rights and democracy in Brazil. And another question, what do you think about these comparisons that a lot of people say?
Let me address the first thing.
Sure.
First, we promote human rights all over the world. We value our long-standing relationship with Brazil. We want to continue to be able to work with them. We'll see what happens from there.
Sarah, can I just... Okay, so what do you think about these comparisons? A lot of people are calling Bolsonaro the Trump of the tropics. And if President Trump plans to invite Bolsonaro to the White House, or if he has any plans to go to Brazil anytime soon, maybe attend Bolsonaro's inauguration.
There's only one Donald Trump, in my opinion. Stephen, go ahead.
I'd like to follow up on John's question about the caravan. The president has used the word invasion to describe this caravan. That's the same word that is mentioned in the Constitution 3 times, invasion, with respect to the powers of the federal government to repel invasion. So my question is have there been any discussions here with respect to that about the fact that the Constitution provides for example, the suspension of habeas corpus if to repel an invasion, if the public safety requires it? Is the president talking about potentially ignoring posse comitatus by having the military go down? There's a provision in the law that allows for a constitutional exemption. Is that in any way under consideration?
We're looking at a number of different options. I know that the Department of Defense is holding a press conference this afternoon at 4 o'clock to talk about some of the actions that they'll be taking. I would encourage you to tune into that. John?
That's not a note of my question. It has not been ruled out. Those are options on the table?
Look, I'm not going to get into specific policies that we're considering. There's a number of actions that we're looking at taking. When we're ready to make an announcement on that front, we'll let you know. John?
Thanks a lot, Sarah. The midterms are 8 days from today, and we often get from both parties what the midterms actually mean the day after the election. So I wanted to ask you what the midterms mean before the election. The president on October the 18th in Mississippi said, I'm not on the ticket, but I am on the ticket because this is also a referendum on me. Is that right? Is this midterm election a referendum on the president?
Look, I can't get into specifics that will impact the election, but I can tell you that the president wants to see more people that support his policies elected than not. Phil.
Sarah, it's now been 4 weeks since Jamal Khashoggi was murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The president said early on that if the Saudis are found responsible, there would be severe punishment. That's his word. It's now obvious to the world that Khashoggi was murdered. It was premeditated. It was by the Saudis. Why has there been no action?
Look, the president met last week with CIA Director Gina Haspel after having gathered additional intelligence on her overseas trip, and the administration is weighing different options and will make an announcement about what the decision of that action is.
Is he considering any actual action?
Like I just said, the administration is considering what action we will take moving forward based on that information and the briefing that the president received last week. Jill.
I want to go back to the tone question, because the president said he was planning to tone down his rhetoric this week. But at his rallies, since the suspicious packages began being mailed, the president has called out Maxine Waters by name at his rallies. He's stood there as his supporters chant "lock her up" in reference to Hillary Clinton, who he continues to call crooked Hillary Clinton. Will the president stop using that kind of language in light of the fact that these individuals were targeted by his attack?
The president's going to continue to draw contrast. Let's not forget that these same Democrats have repeatedly attacked the president, whether it was Eric Holder saying kick them when they're down, whether it was Hillary Clinton saying you can't be civil until Democrats have control of Congress, or whether it was Maxine Waters who encouraged her supporters to get up, not just in the president's face, but all administration officials' faces. Those actions are from those Democrats. The president's going to continue to fight back when these individuals not only attack him, but attack members of his administration and supporters of his administration. John? Sorry, go ahead.
Follow up on something else. Why does the president feel like it's necessary to send active duty troops to the border when he's already sent National Guardsmen down there who are doing the exact same job as the active duty troops would be able to do?
The president's number one job and number one priority is to protect the safety and security of Americans, and he's going to do what he deems necessary in order to do that. For specifics regarding that, I'd encourage you to tune into the press conference this afternoon. John?
Thank you, Sarah. Two brief questions. The first, a follow-up about the question on Brazil. Up until a few months ago, you used to give us readouts of the president's calls with world leaders, including congratulatory calls to newly elected leaders, such as President Macron, Chancellor Merkel. Did the president, or does the president plan to make a call to President-elect Bolsonaro?
He did, and he spoke with him last night. I actually sent a note to the White House press pool. If you didn't receive that, I'll make sure you do after the briefing's over. Sorry, second question.
Sarah, is this, with the election 8 days away, some Republicans, such as Mr. Hugan, the nominee for the Senate in New Jersey, do not mention the president at all, do not invoke his name or image. Others, such as Mr. DeWine, running for governor of Ohio, have him in brochures and pictures. Is the president aware that some candidates run against him, and is this going to enter into his decision where to go in the final days?
That's a decision for individual candidates to make. I think the president has an incredible story to tell. He's had a historic first 2 years, a number of successes that I think any Republican running for office should be proud of. Jim.
Sir, yeah, I wanted to ask you, David Lappin, who was spokesperson over at DHS under General Kelly, Chief of Staff Kelly, a former Marine, worked at the Pentagon, tweeted this morning, I dealt with the news media nearly every day. I know quite a bit about the press and know this. They are not the enemy of the American people. Shouldn't you reserve the term enemy for people who are actually the enemy of the United States rather than journalists?
The president's not referencing all media. He's talking about the growing amount of fake news that exists in the country, and the president's calling that out.
May I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
May
Go ahead.
I ask a follow-up, please? May
Go
I
ahead,
ask a follow-up, please? Since you mentioned that, the president said this morning the fake news media, the true enemy of the people, must stop the open and obvious hostility and report the news accurately and fairly. Can you state for the record which outlets that you and the president regard as the enemy of the people?
I'm not going to walk through a list, but I think those individuals probably know who they are.
Would that include my outlet, which received the bomb
I don't think
last
it's
week?
necessarily specific to a general, broad generalization of a full outlet at times. I think there's individuals that the president would be referencing. Jordan.
So you're not going to state for the record then. I mean, if the president is going to say the fake news media are the enemy of the people, and if you're going to stand there and continue to say that there are some journalists, some news outlets in this country that meet that characterization, shouldn't you have the guts, Sarah, to state which outlets Which journalists are the enemy of the people?
Well, I think it's irresponsible of a news organization like yours to blame responsibility of a pipe bomb that was not sent by the president, not just blame the president, but blame members of his administration for those heinous acts. I think that is outrageous, and I think it's irresponsible. Jordan, go ahead.
Sarah, we didn't say that the
Jim, I've
president-
given you 3 questions. Jordan, go ahead.
Thanks, Sarah. The president has talked multiple times about how the Republican lawmakers are going to protect pre-existing conditions if they keep control of Congress. But the administration is supporting a lawsuit that would undercut those protections under Obamacare and taken a couple of regulatory actions to that effect as well. So how do you square those two stances? And what's the plan, the Republican plan for protecting the
Look, the
pre-existing?
president's health care plan that he's laid out covers pre-existing conditions. The president wants to lower premiums to make health care more affordable. Nobody will be charged higher premiums if they keep their coverage, and nobody will be denied coverage under the president. Emerald?
Thank you, Sarah. On Chancellor Merkel's announcement that she'll be stepping down as party leader and won't seek to rerun as chancellor, what is the reaction from the administration, and how does that affect the relationship with Germany going forward?
We're aware of the announcement, and this is an internal matter for Chancellor and the German people. We're going to continue to work with the Chancellor and continue to develop that relationship. Blake?
Sarah, why did the president
Blake,
call
go ahead.
Andrew Gillum a thief? Why did the president, in his tweet, call Andrew Gillum a thief?
April, I'll come back to you. Blake, go ahead.
Sarah, thank you. Before you walked out here, just a handful of minutes before you walked out, there was a report that said, should the meeting between President Trump and President Xi of China not go well in terms of easing the trade war, the trade tensions, then at that point the U.S. would go forth with the $257 billion in tariffs. Is that indeed the timetable that the administration is working with here?
I'm not going to get ahead of the president's meeting, and I hope it goes well. April, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
How important is that meeting then? Because we heard Larry Kudlow say last week or 2 weeks ago that maybe there might not be a lot of detail that comes from it in terms of trade and going back and forth.
As the president likes to say, we'll see what happens. I'm not going to get ahead of the conversation. You have 2 of the most powerful leaders in the world. I think that's consequential no matter how you look at it, and we'll see what happens when they sit down. April,
The
go ahead.
president's tweeting today, in one tweet specifically, he called Andrew Gillum, the Democratic nominee for governor in Florida, a thief. What is his definition of that statement? And also I want to ask you about issues of voter suppression. The president's talked about voter fraud.
Let me answer your first question. That individuals under FBI investigation, I would refer you to that. I'm not going to get into specifics on that matter because it involves 2 candidates running for office, and I'm not going to impact that due to the Hatch Act. I'll leave that to the president to make those types of statements. And your second question.
Yes, second question. The president talks about voter fraud at a time when there are allegations and proof of voter suppression taking place in the state of Georgia, where Stacey Abrams is ahead of the Republican contender, and also in North Dakota, where Native Americans who don't have a street address but have a P.O. box if they live on reservations, they're not able to vote. So what's going on with that? Is the president talking about that? Is he working on that
Certainly,
issue?
we don't support any type of voter suppression. What we do support is voter integrity. Again, I'm not going to weigh into specifics that have impact on this election that's a few days away. I'll leave that for the president to lay out that specific case. Sager, go ahead.
Thanks, Sarah. Could you tell us, does the White House currently believe that they have the legal authority to close the southern border? And is that an option that's being explored with relation to the caravan?
Again, we have a number of options on the table. We're exploring each one of those. When we have a decision on that, we'll let you know. Vivian.
Thanks, Sarah. 2 questions, please. First, last week we asked the president whether he'd call President Obama or any of the others that the bombs were addressed to, and he said, if they want me to, but we'll probably pass. Can you explain why that decision was taken?
The president did speak with Governor Cuomo of New York last week, and as of this time, there aren't any plans for other calls. If there are, we'll let you know. Hallie, go ahead.
So
Last question.
Can I ask one more about Jamal Khashoggi? Can you tell us if CIA Director Haspel actually heard the tape that the Turks allegedly have proving that he was killed in the embassy?
I can't confirm or deny the specifics of the intelligence that Director Haspel saw while she was there. Last question, Hallie, go ahead.
So throughout the course of this briefing, you have repeatedly defended the president's attacks on his political opponents as valid because the midterms are coming up. So at what point does the White House
Not because of the midterms. I've defended the president. I've defended the president fighting back when he's regularly attacked. There's a difference. Doesn't matter if there's a midterm or not. The president's going to defend himself and he's going to fight back.
From a political perspective, right? You're making that point.
From any
it seems.
perspective.
But at what point does a national tragedy take precedence over the president needing to punch back? If not now, when?
I think you saw the president do exactly that in the wake of a national tragedy, not just this week, but every time our country has experienced the type of heartache and pain that we have over the last week. This is a president who's risen to that occasion and worked to bring our country together in a number of occasions, whether it's the hurricanes, whether it's the Las Vegas shooting, whether it was the Pittsburgh shooting, all horrible, horrible tragedies that this country has experienced. And this president has come out, condemned the attacks when it is caused by an individual, and tried to look for ways to provide and bring the country together when it was a natural disaster.
But both he and you have also acknowledged that in the next breath, after he calls for unity, he does talk about division in what you describe as drawing contrast. Is he incapable of, in the words of some, toning it down and toning down the rhetoric?
Again, I think the president has had a number of moments of bringing the country together. Once again, I'll remind you that the very first thing the president did was condemn the attacker, and the very first thing the media did was blame the president. You guys have a huge responsibility to play in the divisive nature of this country when 90% of the coverage of everything this president does is negative, despite the fact that the country is doing extremely well, despite the fact that the president is delivering on exactly what he said he was going to do if elected. And he got elected by an overwhelming majority of 63 million Americans who came out and supported him and wanted to see his policies enacted. He's delivered on that. He's delivered on the promises he's made. And if anything, I think it is sad and divisive the way that every single thing that comes out of the media, 90% of what comes out of the media's mouths is negative about this president. Despite the fact that the economy is booming, despite the fact he said he would fix the trade deals, and he's done exactly that. He said he would defeat ISIS, and he has. The president has been delivering day in, day out, and I think it would be nice if every once in a while we could focus on a few of the positive things the president has done instead of just attacking him. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great day.
No responsibility.
Hi there and welcome to the briefing room. I'm Rick Klein, joined here by Mary Alice Parks. A lot to get to on this Monday, a tense and angry and violent national mood at this moment, just 8 days before the midterm elections. The news out of Pittsburgh coming right after the news of the attempted pipe bombing last week, dominated now by these stories of potential political violence erupting into our politics. News today, the president plans to visit the city of Pittsburgh tomorrow to meet with members of the Jewish community there. We've heard condolences out of the White House toward the Jewish community that was so struck by this tragedy over the weekend. I want to bring in now Ariel Reshef, who's been reporting on the ground for us and is now in front of that synagogue in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, where 11 people were murdered by an alleged gunman on Saturday. Ariel, what has the mood been like today? What's the scene from the ground 48 hours or so after this tragedy?
Well, I can certainly say, Rick, the dichotomy between the press briefing and what's happening here is pretty stark. Right behind me, you can see there are young girls who have come here from a Jewish seminary to pray in front of the memorial and singing beautiful hymns of hope. And it just kind of encapsulates how this community is coming together in the wake of this nightmare that this has been for them. I just was talking to a resident who came up to us before our live shot with you. Her name was Amy. She lives in this area and says there's no one in this area that doesn't have a connection to this synagogue behind us. 11 people murdered here, and the sentiment here is one of hope still, and one of let's shed the hate, let's get rid of the anger, let's please come together as a society and heal from this. 11 innocent victims ranging in age from 54 to 97. 2 brothers were killed. They were a mainstay in this community, Cecil and David Rosenthal. We also know a Holocaust survivor who was 97 years old, was said to be one of the most vivacious characters in this community, gunned down senselessly while she was in her place of worship. And then a married couple who had gotten married in the very sanctuary we're standing in front of 60 years ago also lost their lives. So this community has been through, quite frankly, hell and back, and they're now trying to recover from it. And the only way they know how is by building this makeshift memorial and coming together. We've seen a steady stream of people, an influx, egress of people from all walks of life, all different faiths coming here to pay their respects and express their solidarity. Rick.
And Ariel, from the people that you've talked to, is there a recognition of the broader context of this national discussion that goes around it, or is this very much about the community right there in Pittsburgh?
Well, Rick, as you can imagine, like any community, the Jewish community and the community writ large here in Pittsburgh is a diverse one, a panoply of political affiliations and of ideas and about how we should move forward from this and what brought us to this point. But what I can tell you is not being discussed here in front of this memorial is politics. I haven't heard one person come up to me and rant about the state of affairs in our country or talk about the upcoming elections. What people are talking about is how our society has to come together and has to learn from events like this. This is not just a Jewish issue, as the rabbi said this morning on Good Morning America. This is an American issue. The fact that people cannot go to a place of worship and feel safe, it affects all of us. It doesn't just affect the Jewish community. Rick.
All right, Ariel Reshef, reporting for us in Pittsburgh. Thank you for your reporting and your perspective from the ground, Ariel. Appreciate it. And Mary Alice, we've heard now from the White House at a couple different opportunities, the president and his initial reaction, and Sarah Sanders today about their condolences for the Jewish community. We also heard a tweet from the president. He's been pretty active on Twitter, not a lot of public events in the last 24 hours, but this is what he had to say. There is great anger in our country caused in part by inaccurate and even fraudulent reporting of the news. The fake news media, the true enemy of the people, must stop the open and obvious hostility and report the news accurately and fairly. That will do much to put the flame of anger and outrage, and we will then be able to bring all sides together in peace and harmony. Fake news must end. That's a pretty startling sentiment from the president at this time of national mourning and a lot of national anger.
Right. People respond when the president of the United States calls a group the enemy of the people. And we watched Sarah Sanders there in the briefing today really have a hard time using sort of circular logic, saying that on the one hand, the president wasn't placing blame, but going on to repeat those claims. She very much continued to blame the press, continued to take no blame as far as the heated rhetoric for this White House. I felt like in the briefing she was really working towards, it was a defensive briefing. She came out there to defend this president, to defend the White House, defend the staff, and to basically make the claim that they were wrongfully attacked this week because, as we know, across the country, we saw many people ask whether the president was to blame in some way for his heated rhetoric and his violent comments over the last 2 years.
I want to play a little bit of our colleague John Carl at that briefing that you referenced, talking to Sarah Sanders and challenging the White House over the president's tweets.
Sir, the president said over the weekend that he could tone up his rhetoric. What does he mean by that? And does he have any concern at all that his words could inspire or provoke troubled people to do awful things?
Certainly, the president wants, in moments where our country is hurting like we've seen in the last several days, find ways to bring our country together, and we've seen him do exactly that. However, the president is going to continue to draw contrast, particularly as we go into the final days of an election, the differences between the two parties, particularly on policy differences. You'll continue to see him make that contrast. But he has certainly, I think, found those moments to bring our country together and certainly focus on some of the things that all of us can support and all of us can condemn as well.
Let's bring in our colleague, Jonathan Karl, over at the White House. And John, you asked the president about the comments that he has made on Twitter, the tone that he has been setting. It seemed like Sarah Sanders didn't really want to go there in terms of the substance of even what the president himself was tweeting.
Sarah said that the president was trying to bring the country together, and it was kind of a shame that the media was casting blame on this. I then, Rick, tried to point out that it was the president that's been casting blame. In fact, very strong, direct blame this morning. Take a listen to the rest of it. He's also harshly attacked some of the very people that received those pipe bombs, and this morning suggesting that the news media is responsible for the anger in the country. How does he do that when, in the case of the pipe bomber, this was somebody who went to Trump rallies, this is somebody who had a van covered with attacks on the media and praise for the president? The shooter in Pittsburgh is somebody who was provoked, it seems, by the caravan that the president has spent so much time talking about. Why is he out there? When you say he's trying to unite the country, why is he out there making these
Jonathan,
attacks?
the very first thing that the president did was condemn the attacks both in Pittsburgh and in the pipe bombs. The very first thing the media did was blame the president and make him responsible for these ridiculous acts. That is outrageous that would be the very first reaction of so many people across this country. I'm not finished. The only person responsible for carrying out either of these heinous acts were the individuals who carried them out. It's not the president, no more than it was Bernie Sanders' fault for the individual who shot up a baseball field of congressional Republicans. You can't start putting the responsibility of individuals on anybody but the individual who carries out the crime.
But why is the president suggesting it's the news media? The president's the one placing blame here.
No, the president's not placing blame. The president's not responsible for these acts. Again, the very first action that the president did was condemn these heinous acts. The very first thing that the media did was condemn the president and go after and try to place blame, not just on the president, but everybody that works in this administration. The major news network's first public statement was to blame the president, and myself included. I mean, that is outrageous that anybody other than the individual who carried out the crime would hold that responsibility.
So, Rick, I have to say, as a card-carrying member of the news media, I haven't seen any of us blame the president for what happened. I don't know if maybe there's somebody somewhere on cable TV who has said that, but I think the very first thing that was done by news organizations across the board was to go and report what happened, both in terms of the spate of bombings and in terms of the horrific shooting that happened in Pittsburgh. So it's a little bit of an uncomfortable situation to be in the briefing room when the press secretary, you're trying to ask a question about the president's tone, and the press secretary is kind of putting you in a situation where you have to speak on behalf of the, quote, media for something that I'm not sure has happened.
John, do you get any sense that the White House is aware of or looking in any way to moderate what the president is about to do in the last 8 days of this campaign? He's going to be on the trail a lot starting on Wednesday. As he said, and as you quoted to Sarah Sanders, he could tone it up. He says he could suggesting he could turn up his political rhetoric back to where it was before. Is there any sense of a different attitude going into this last stretch?
Well, here's what we know, is that starting Wednesday, he has at least 11 different campaign rallies for the 1 week period leading into Election Day. 11 different rallies all over the country, all centered in areas where Trump's support is strong. What you know about the president's advisors is they don't try to control him. They have seen that is something that is simply not effective. They have encouraged him. They did encourage him in the wake of this to set a somber tone, to address the attacks. But nobody can go into this president and say, Mr. President, you got to tone down the attacks. Nobody can do that. And I think that the idea that this president will go on a tour of 11 different campaign rallies over 6 or 7 days, and suddenly become a different person on the campaign trail, I think is kind of a fantasy.
All right, John Karl for us over at the White House. Thanks for checking in. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Mary Alice, as we mentioned, these stories are kind of coming fast and furious. Today is actually the first court hearing for Cesar Sayoc, who is accused of sending more than a dozen pipe bombs, attempted bombings of major media figures, as well as prominent Democrats. And in fact, just today, CNN says it received another package at its Atlanta headquarters that looks very similar to the ones that Mr. Sayoc is accused of sending.
It's another reason that those tweets that we referenced earlier, calling the media the enemy of the people, seems so shocking and surprising. It's almost as if the president either isn't watching or is just disregarding what looks like a real threat to the press.
He also went after Tom Steyer, who was one of the one of the possible targets in these attacks, these attempted attacks just over the weekend. Want to turn to another story that's developing at this hour. We're getting more information about a plan by the U.S. military, as directed by President Trump, to send up to 5,000 additional U.S. troops to the border, in part as a response to this migrant caravan that is still hundreds of miles and many, many days away from reaching the border with the United States. Louis Martinez, our man at the Pentagon, has some more details, and I know there's still more to learn here, but what is your reporting so far of what is being called by the Pentagon Operation Faithful Patriot?
That's right, Rick. That's the name that the Pentagon has given to this operation, where they're going to call up 5,000 active duty troops and send them down to the border states, 3 of the states in particular, Texas, Arizona, and California. The plan here is that these active duty troops are going to provide logistical support to the Customs and Border Protection personnel that are along the border. We were told last week that the Pentagon is getting involved because the CBP had a standing request for additional support, and I guess the president put in the order that there should be active duty troops that provide this level of support. Now, let's not forget that there are already 2,000 National Guard troops that are along the border, and they are pretty much doing the same thing. They are supporting Customs Border Protection personnel in enforcing whatever it is along the border. But one of the things that they cannot do is they cannot provide law enforcement duties. That is strictly prohibited by federal law. But one of the things that they can do is provide support, and that's why they're providing this logistical and technical support. We're told that the first troops may arrive along the border. If not along the border, then maybe at staging areas as early as tomorrow on Tuesday.
There's a lot of questions online following the White House briefing today, where Sarah Sanders seemed to say that other options were on the table. A lot of questions about what she didn't say or didn't rule out. You were talking there about what is current federal law, what dictates what those troops can do currently under current federal law. But are there any other options that the White House or the Pentagon could be exploring that would really change the calculus or change their role there on the border?
Not that we've heard of, Mary Alice. One of the things that has been stressed here is that when the president kind of signaled his intent last week to military commanders that he wanted active duty troops to be assisting along the border, that there was a legal review that was undertaken to ensure how this could be done legally. Because as we know, this posse comitatus, this is an act put into law following the Civil War, kind of prevented U.S. federal troops from providing law enforcement duties. So when this new capability was requested by the Department of Homeland Security, the lawyers here at the Pentagon looked to see what could be doable, and they determined that it was allowed. Let's not forget that there are active duty troops that have been along the border now for almost several decades now, providing assistance in the counter-drug effort, the flow of drugs into the United States from along the southern border. But I think the question you're referring to was about, could habeas corpus be revoked? Could there be additional waivers that could be granted to posse comitatus, which I guess are possibilities that reporter was inquiring about, but you heard from Sarah that kind of a non-committal answer. I think, to me, it sounded like she was just keeping options open, but I don't know that that signals an actual intent to pursue that, because, I mean, that would be hugely significant. And as far as we can tell here, I mean, this is strictly just the Pentagon coming through with assistance as requested by DHS.
Louis Martinez over at the Pentagon for us. Thank you, Louis. Appreciate it. And you can't ignore the politics of this moment either, Mary Alice. The president has made a lot out of this migrant caravan. Right now, we could be talking about more U.S. troops at the border than actual people as part of this caravan. And this is not like some band of marauding criminals. For the most part, these are very impoverished people. Many women, children, weak people. Many of them suffering from starvation or near starvation, nutrition issues. They're coming to the border. They're presumably to ask for asylum at the border.
Well, not presumably. They've said that explicitly. The people that we've had there reporting from the caravan have often heard verbatim that that's the plan for a lot of these migrants, that they are seeking asylum. They want to make their case for asylum and refugee status. And that's what we saw with the last caravan that looked similar. We actually saw many of them not try to cross illegally, not try to cross in the middle of the night, but to go to the regular border crossings and try to make their case. It was interesting listening to Louis break down what the troops are able to do and not do. And you really get the sense that this is about optics more than anything, political optics more than anything. It's hard to see what those troops would really do or how they would change the calculus of enforcing the border on the ground.
And we're going to hear more as the day and days go on from the president as well as the Pentagon on that. We are now only 8 days away from the midterm elections. A week from tomorrow, tomorrow, Mary Alice. It's occupying a lot of our time in terms of preparations, a lot of big plans around that, and a lot of campaigning out there in the final stretch. We're joined now by Ben Siegel from Youngstown, Ohio, our colleague here at ABC, where Vice President Joe Biden, the former Vice President, will be campaigning later today with the gubernatorial candidate. A bit of an untold story so far of this election is some of the Democratic hopes in the Midwest. The president, the former vice president, is someone who's got a good deal of popularity in this part of the country. What are we expecting to hear today, Ben?
That's right. Well, this is a region that Democrats traditionally win. Donald Trump did very well here on his way to winning the state of Ohio in 2016. So we're expected to hear Vice President Biden with Rich Cordray. He's the gubernatorial nominee, try to rally young voters in Youngstown State University here. And we could really see possibly what Democrats are hoping for, which is a shift on election night next week, returning a lot of these Midwestern Rust Belt states back to the Democrats. This is the area that Donald Trump carried to win his way to the White House. But we could conceivably see Democrats back in power in lots of governor's mansions from Wisconsin to Ohio, and strong showings in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. So Vice President Mike Pence is in Michigan today. Part of that swing, the Republicans are not giving up the Midwest. But one of the surprise stories we could see is this region totally swinging back to the left, to the Democratic side.
And Ben, talk about the tone at this moment. The vice president has had a lot to say about this, both the current and former vice presidents, regarding the tone of conversation. And you've heard from Joe Biden in recent days, I think more sharply than he has in the past, lay a lot of this at President Trump's feet. It seems like Democrats, they obviously want to be careful with how they choose their words at this moment, but this moment of anger, this moment of violence, has a lot of them talking about the tone set by President Trump.
Yeah, they're laying this right at the feet of the president. President Obama, a couple of days ago, in one of his most direct rebukes possible that he's given of President Trump, was very critical after the terror attacks, the suspected bombs that were sent out to news organizations, to different figures. So we're seeing Democrats take a much sharper tone here, really hoping to take some of that anger and frustration and show their voters that they can channel that at the ballot box next week.
All right, Ben Siegel for us in Youngstown, Ohio. We'll be watching your reporting tonight and into tomorrow as you travel with the former Vice President Joe Biden.
And I think that Ben's exactly right. It was interesting to listen to Ariel say that politics wasn't being discussed there on the ground in Pittsburgh. But we know that those issues of increased violence, increased anti-Semitism, are being discussed in politics around the rest of the country. We have seen Democrats put the questions of civility, the lack of civility, the president's rhetoric on the ballot. Also issues like gun safety reform on the ballot. These have become real political issues, and voters are going to have a choice.
All right, 8 days to go. We'll be there every step of the way. Thank you for watching The Briefing Room. For Mary Alice Parks, I'm Rick Klein. Download the ABC News app and catch us here next time on The Briefing Room.